This is Conspirinormal.
All right, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal. It's good to be back with you guys. And coming up at the end of the week that this is going to be posted on April 22nd, we've got our next Strange Realities online event. And that is with the guests that we have on tonight. And we're going to talk a little bit about that presentation and whatever other subjects we might want to get into with the guests tonight. But I want to just briefly describe what this is. We're going to be doing a presentation by Marco Acevedo, who's with us right now.
Hello.
Called The Spark and the Vessel, Reverse Engineering the Flying Saucer Archetype. And we're going to be starting this on April 22nd, Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And of course, if you guys are out there listening, two ways to do that. If you wanted to join in, is either become a Patreon at $10 or above. That gets you automatically in. In fact, just today, as the day we're recording this, on the 12th, I just posted that up for Patreons, and you guys get a Zoom link and you just go to it from there. The other way is that we've got those on Eventbrite. If you don't want to become a Conspirinormal Patreon, you just want to pay the $10 one time. That is also available as well, and that will be linked up to the show notes of this episode. So those are the ways that you can find that if you want to join us. But Marco Acevedo is here with us. Marco, welcome to Conspirinormal.
Thank you, guys. It's really great to be here.
Yeah. This is actually the first time we've had you on the show, but not the first time that we've ever interacted. Right. You have been a big part of our online meetups back when we were calling it the Mystic Crew back last year.
Still the Mystic Crew, but
it is. I was going to say, is it not the Mystic Crew? Okay.
Well, yeah, I guess the Mystic Crew and the
are still the $10 events. Patrons and invited special.
Yes. That's we've kind of combined the two ideas. So
because the Mystic Crew started out as a sort of almost like a private Strange Realities or kind of a Patreon Strange Realities.
Yeah. So how it kind of started was during COVID, or the beginning of COVID. We decided we'd do like this big meetup in May of 2020, and we did this I think we were there for like 6 hours. Which mostly
that was an epic one. That was just Alan Greenfield, wasn't it?
Alan Greenfield pontificating the entire time. And so we did that.
I think I missed that one, or maybe we did it.
It's recorded somewhere.
Yeah, I've got it. It's not been released or anything, but I do have it. And we decided that we were going to start doing that for our Patreons back at the beginning of last year. And so we started doing these once every month for a while. And you've been involved with us, just hanging out, and then others have too, like Chris Corey and David Metcalf, Stephanie Quick, and a bunch of other people. Jennifer
Each one
Campbell.
Based around a single presentation in the same kind of format.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So we had the idea to start doing the presentations just as a fun thing, and just to kind of make it a little less more like a meetup, but then we could have the presentation, and then everybody could hang out afterwards. And then we decided beginning of this year, we were just going to start, charging for these and really start doing them as a once a month.
Yeah. Awesome.
Once a month thing. And you've actually done one of these with us at one of the hangouts, but this, which I guess is the kind of the precursor to this presentation.
Yeah.
So
that was the beginning of my doom. Yeah. That was and that's up, right? Is that still available?
Anyone who becomes a patron at the $10 and up level can still access all of those as well. So you basically get like a hidden chapter of these.
There's a couple of those I don't have up. I think I do have yours up though. I had to go back and check, but I'm pretty sure they're just for Patreons.
Pretty sure. Yeah, I'm pretty sure mine. It was up last time I saw it because.
Okay.
Actually, I did a show with Barbara Fisher.
Yeah.
And I was starting to talk because I had in a previous discussion, I had sort of hinted at the idea of this whole project I've been working on, and she was intrigued. And so then rather than sort of like go too far back, I actually just sent her the link to I think she,
here it is.
Leveled up and checked it out. And so that was sort of like me telling her, well, this is the germ of the idea that is now out of control. The funny thing is, it all really started with, I guess we can sort of start this way. I can be quick about the origin of this whole thing. I had posted something. Oh, and by the way, I love how this is all at the intersection of all of these different podcasts and presenters and communities. I mean, that's kind of like how my brain works. I listen to all of these different resources, like your show and Barbara's show and Radio Misterioso and Facebook pages, and my brain just starts associating things that I pick up from different sources and string them together and turn them into sort of an idea or a question, at least. But I had posted something on the Radio Misterioso Facebook page about a particular UFO sighting that in its day was sort of like a momentary classic. It was a photograph that just sort of was everywhere for a little while, but then NICAP investigated, and they ended up kind of shutting the files on that because they determined it was a hoax. And I'm talking about what became known as the Zanesville saucer, right? It was this one of those kind of really amazing daytime disc photographs. Most of which, I mean, there's a lot of those, not as many these days, but there's a whole host of those photographs from the 50s and 60s, especially black and white, and you sort of tend to encounter them, or, my generation encountered them in these little paperbacks in the 60s and 70s on UFOs, and they were all just like amazing and terrifying and kind of like, whoa, what is that? Look at that thing. It's right there. It's over that house. And it looks so solid. And then you get older and you think, well, that looks kind of fake, or that I could see how you could fake something like that. But still, they have this sort of power, these daytime disc photos. And there are three that are like my favorites. And one of them is the Zanesville saucer photograph. And I just did a whole post on kind of falling into that rabbit hole in terms of, I think I wanted to find out where this place was. I somehow wanted to know where the house was. Not that I was going to, go there. It's in Ohio. I'm all the way over in Evanston, Illinois. But I like to, find out where, to me, these places where these kind of sightings, quote unquote sightings, whether they're hoax or not, but these places become associated in one's mind, if you are into this material, and especially historic material like that. Those are almost like places of power, whether it was actually a hoax or not. It's sort of like, I wanted to know where that place was, what else could I find out about that area? Was there something interesting about it? And I ended up finding the actual house on Google Street View. And it sort of blew my mind. I was like, there it is. That's the house. It looks different. But it sort of just made it real for me, whatever the actual provenance of that image was. And then I just fell down a rabbit hole of doing research on that. And I found a bunch of files from the NICAP investigation, which was really interesting because there were, it was a thorough investigation. They took pictures of the house from different angles, trying to reproduce the angles in the photographs and the lighting, times of day. And ultimately, I think they determined that, so these are Polaroids, I think, and they had a series of numbers on the back, and they determined that the order that the pictures were taken in contradicted his narrative. And sort of like that, just from there, the whole thing just started falling apart for them anyway. They felt that they couldn't stick to the case because it was now no longer credible because of this discrepancy. I still don't know what to think about all that. There's something that nags at me about that photograph. I don't know. There's just something weird. I think the funniest thing about it is that Zanesville, which I don't know anything about aside from that photograph, as I was doing research, it turned out that was the birthplace of, what's his name? Thomas Townsend Brown, which I'm pretty sure has been discussed on your show. He was one of the founders of NICAP, but he was also like a big name in the whole anti-gravity thing. He was one of the early anti-gravity technologists.
Yeah, we might have talked with him when we did the show about NICAP with Jack Brewer back in November.
Yep. Yeah.
I talked about him then. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. That's what he did mention.
Familiar. Right.
Yeah. Robert Townsend Brown. And also I think he spoke about some connection between Brown and the CIA, which I can't remember the details of, but there was a lot of intelligence agency connections within NICAP. So yeah, not too surprising there. Yeah. I don't know if it means anything, but I just thought it was fun that, Zanesville was the site of this saucer, and also the birthplace of the Brown family. That was like their home. That was their hometown. And also the fact that he founded NICAP and NICAP ended up investigating it. It seems like if one pokes further, there might be some kind of something going on there, but I don't know. It may all be sheer coincidence. But that got a good response, that post. And I think Surfiel asked me, because this is like when you guys started the Mystic Crew presentations. And I think Surfiel asked me to maybe do something on that. And what happened was I started to pull together that material, and then it just sort of intersected with this other line of thinking that I'd been on for a few years now, since after the whole Tic Tac, UAP, New York Times thing blew up. And then, so after I put this together, the presentation, I almost felt like apologizing to Surfield. It's like, yeah, no, this has almost nothing to do now with the Zanesville saucer. It was in there, but it became much bigger than that.
Yeah, and I think I saw something like I saw something in raw form, and with those, I was really encouraging people to take these like ideas and like flesh them out more, because I knew it could really be fleshed into something that'd be really interesting. So yeah, it makes sense that it would go in a lot of different directions.
Yeah. So basically, and that first presentation, if folks go check it out, it starts to lay the groundwork of some thinking of mine that started, like I said, right after the New York Times revelations. What is that being called now? The soft disclosure, soft disclosure. When that happened, I think everyone who's been following this, everyone who's in the field, quote unquote, especially on the side of things that's not nuts and bolts, felt like something was off, like something was being basically the whole field was it felt like it was being reset. The Pentagon was finally saying, okay, we're going to start talking about this, but we're going to own the narrative. And so forget all this other stuff. It's now about these little tiny things that we can't explain, but that, look, they're so small and they're just like in the crosshairs of our, fantastic military technology. It's sort of like a reduction of all of the wonder, right? That the phenomenon had offered up until that point. And that's still there for people who choose to look, but they seem to be reframing the narrative. And right around that time, speaking of reframing, I read the book Reframing the Debate.
Yeah, that's a great book.
It's a fantastic book. I feel like that book was ground zero for me in terms of some really, really good, really resourceful starting points to look at the phenomenon.
Yeah, I did a couple of shows just devoted to that book.
Yeah.
Because there were so many authors that contributed to it. I talked to at least maybe more than half of them that were part of that book.
And the folks who contributed to that book I've continued to follow them. I've met some of them. They formed as sort of the core of this community that you guys are in, and that I feel lucky enough to sort of like come into. But one of the things that I thought was really great about that book was that it offered a way into the phenomenon that was personal. That yes, there's decades and decades of examining this phenomenon with calipers, right? With measuring things, taking a scientific approach, a sort of a data scientist approach, and that's all super important. And it's important that continues. But one of the reasons that Jacques Vallée is one of my favorite figures in all this is that he takes that approach, and yet he says to this day, right? What was that Wired interview? How many years has he been looking at this since the 50s, and he still doesn't know what it is? He has some insights about what it might be about, but he really doesn't know what it is. And I think that is the position that one starts with. And then, when you read, like you take that book and you read the essays by Mike Cleland, other experiencers, Greg Bishop, who's hugely influential on how I think about this phenomenon as something that seems real, overlaps with the unreal, and is essentially something that human beings can't process. And so they have to come up with some way of processing it, which involves a narrative of some kind or another, because that's all we can do as human beings. And this thing seems so far beyond our normal wiring. So all of those things really started me off on, kind of pushed me into the next level of this. I mean, I've always followed this because it was fun. I've always been an enthusiast of the paranormal, of UFOs, of Bigfoot. Well, more so now than when I was younger. But it's not been my professional bailiwick. It's just something that has been around since I was a kid. And I started listening to podcasts around this material around that time, 2017, 2016. And reading that book made me realize that many people can have a valid perspective on the UFO question, or the question of this phenomenon, whatever it is.
Right.
It could be UFOs, there's lots of different things. And so I started thinking about my own life, and I started thinking back to where I encountered all this stuff. I mean, in culture, not in reality. Although when you think about it, I'm like a lot of people who think about it and go, well, actually there was that time that I saw whatever. But I started out with just my own life in my generation. And this is something that's in that first presentation. I was born in 1961. I have a vague recollection of the Kennedy assassination. I just saw it as a striped box on wheels pulled by a horse. That was like my image that burned into my memory, probably when I was about 3 years old.
Oh, like the casket? Yeah.
Yep. Right. The casket procession. And so that's how my earliest memories were. All these sort of it's sort of iconographic. It's like these visual, simple pictures that have just sort of burned themselves into my brain. And, in that era also, I watched television all the time. My parents had a little black and white set. And And things like the various network logos burned themselves into my brain. The Pan Am logo, my parents took me to the World's Fair, and things like the globe with the orbits around it. This is the New York, the Queen's New York 64, 65 World's Fair.
Okay, yeah. That's what I was thinking the year was, yeah.
Yeah. So, here I am, 3, 4, 5 years old, and my brain is getting filled with all of these standalone images and icons. And I don't know what they are. It's the idea of branding, of course, is beyond me as a kid. I know that some images are connected to things that I want, like a toy or like a toy company, Mattel, or what's the one that you can retrace over and over again. Anyway, that's when I kind of became aware of things like logos and symbols. Oh, and I saw things like the nuclear fallout shelter symbols that were all over the city. And they're still around. You can still find them. They're all like faded, but they're still there. And I used to wonder, what is that, And that all seemed to be of a similar language, the stuff that I would see on TV, stuff I'd see on the street. And I think I was always intrigued by it because I knew it meant something, but it wasn't part of the daily communication with my parents or my friends. It was just sort of there. It's in the environment. And also, the other classic one is the test pattern on a TV. That had that really left an impression on me, because this idea of the television shutting off, like, you can watch shows forever and ever and ever. And then at a certain hour at night, it all finished, all wrapped up. Someone would play the anthem, you'd see the flag, and then you'd see this like mysterious mandala like thing, and there was a mystery to me with that.
Yeah, I still remember. I even remember all that. Like that was still going on when I was a kid.
Yeah.
If you didn't have cable, the stuff shut off at a certain point.
And thinking back to that, I associate that period of my life with, I guess on one level, I associated with things like Lost, like the shows that I watched, Lost in Space, Outer Limits. So the Flying Saucer is definitely a part of that iconographic language, right? I associate it with that time. And something that I've noticed, again, being of my generation and, having experienced like the internet for the first time, I still remember what that was like. I still remember what it was like when Steve Jobs demonstrated the iPhone for the first time. And these were all like these sort of mind-blowing things that are really, really hard. It's hard to convey the feelings that you get when you first experience something like that. I think every generation has that. They have those experiences that kind of reset their brains, rewired them, that are taken for granted by every following generation. And then over time, the original kind of WTF wonder of it just fades away, and it just becomes another thing that you take for granted. And so thinking of it that way, I started wondering what was it like before things became cliche, or before the flying saucer became kind of almost like a visual joke. What was it like for people to really see these things for the first time in that time? What did it mean in the context of the era, which was right after World War II? And
that's people seeing them through these photographs also, not just actual eyewitness, right?
Right. There's eyewitness stuff, and then there's the way it started getting seeded out in the culture with photographs and with illustrations, and also with I'll say it, hoaxes. I don't know that anyone today is convinced that the scout ship was a real flying saucer, the Adamski photograph. But the provenance of that is really, really interesting, that it was a piece of hardware. And as you guys know, that became kind of part of the DNA of that first presentation of mine.
Do you think that some of that was more believable at the time because it was, that imagery was so new? I mean, like the picture that the Zanesville picture and the Adamski stuff, like, I mean, now they look really silly and quaint to us.
Right.
But at the time, people just did not know. Like they'd never seen anything like that. And I think, you know, we're spoiled by stuff like, I mean, starting with like Star Wars and how realistic special effects can be.
Right.
You know, special effects were so pokey and bad in the 50s that, you know, just seeing that static image, you could more convince somebody with a static image than you could with a moving image, because even then I would have thought they would say, well, you know, you know, Ed Wood, you know, with the plates and setting them on a fire, you know, it's just,
right. And they kind of jiggle and
right.
Yeah. It's see, that's the thing. It's, it takes time for the human mind to process stuff. Maybe it might take a couple of generations. That's part of what I find really fascinating about this whole field. Like I once, you know, I'm a big James Bond fan, and I read somewhere in some book about Bond movies that one of the revolutionary things about the earliest Bond movies was their editing. They moved so fast. Now you look at like Dr. No or something, and it seems kind of clumsy and, you know, it doesn't move fast at all. Some people would say it's boring. It's people's perception of things just moves along and along and along. Like they'll say something like, if a cinema audience from silent movie days, if they saw something like a James Bond movie, I mean, aside from just the visual cultural differences, they wouldn't simply not be able to process the narrative because it just moved so fast. And I thought that was fascinating. How this subject just like balloons and gets so huge.
Yeah, but you're saying that like the symbolism and iconography of the saucers fit into the like corporate and technological symbolic language of the time.
Yeah. Well, as I looked into it, that sort of caused me to come up with this idea of the American technological imaginal, which, you know, not that I am a completely versed expert on Jungian psychology and the idea of the imaginal as it's been developed by other writers after him. But, you know, basically, if you take the idea of a daimonic reality, which is Harper's idea, which is basically the big conundrum, that a lot of this phenomena seems to exist in this funny nether region, this liminal space between the material and the concrete and documentable and the human imagination, right? Someone can come in and say, well, these are all they're just dreams or fantasies or hallucinations. And you might almost be convinced until you read enough of these things and you realize, well, no, sometimes these things seem to leave traces. It's just this, you know, bedeviling weird area where stuff sort of seems, you know, things seem to be real and at the same time they seem to not be real. And, you know, the Joshua Cutchin's and Tim Renner's book on Bigfoot is like a perfect example of that. Something that I used to just dismiss as, well, so what if there's some kind of relict ape running around the forest? It's a cool idea. I didn't think it was all that interesting. To me, it was like Bigfoot either is a lot of BS or it's real and not interesting because it's just a new animal. But, you know, reading a book like that, you realize, no, it's Bigfoot, like UFOs, like ghosts, like other things, just falls into this very strange zone of that just seems to exist to sort of push the human mind further along and to poke it and prod at it until it needs to, I don't know, evolve into a new perspective, because our tools don't cover this kind of thing.
That sounds kind of like Valet's control mechanism or something like that.
Yeah, Valet, Keel, Harper. To me, those guys are like the Trinity. It's like they each have a little piece of this idea that seems to be the same idea, and that's really hard to get across to somebody who's just enmeshed in, the purely material. Let's pull this back a little bit. I started to talk about in that presentation the beginnings of what I call the American technological imaginal, different than the imaginal that psychologists, cultural psychologists write about, which usually involve myth and religion, traditions that are centuries old. My contention is that something started to change, with all the more recent stuff I've been looking into. I think it all really started to change with the Enlightenment and the court of Louis XIV. But before we get there, the first presentation was about American culture in the 20th century and the fact that starting from the 20s, when you had, that was the big blow up of the radio as a consumer item. What's interesting is I started looking into the history of radio. Radio did not have to launch itself as a consumer product. It could have remained something that, say, the Navy developed. Like radio could have simply have been technology for ships to remain in contact with each other, right? Like a military tactical tool.
But mostly using Morse code, yeah.
Right. And somehow, in a way that parallels the development of the internet, it kind of broke out of the military, laboratory and entered into the commercial space and just took on a life of its own. And so this happened in the 1920s. Everyone started buying radios. Publishers started putting out magazines aimed at the radio buff market. And it seems like consumer real modern American consumer culture kind of started there. And so did modern ideas of marketing, right? Because you had private companies taking over, you had corporations taking over the technology of the radio and turning it around and trying to figure out how to make it a commodity. And then they came up with the idea of on-air commercials, and you can imagine the whole thing just blew up and became something else. And it also became a vehicle for culture, for creativity, and for culture. The 20s also saw the beginning of science fiction. So Hugo Gernsback started out with radio magazines, but he also picked up on the fact that the radio and that kind of technology captured the imagination of the American consumer in a particular way that involves the romantic imagination and like pulp fiction and stuff like that. And so he started another series of magazines that were about science and technology, but that also told thrilling stories of the future. But they were, the language that all those magazines used, they had the same cover artists. To me, the great cover artist of that time, his name escapes me at the moment, but he created a lot of the iconic images that became iconic to science fiction. And I kind of think he, in a way, invented the classic flying saucer. But that's just part of the story. The 20s, you had radio, you had consumers beginning to understand technology on a personal, at-home level. Before this, technology was beyond the ken and direct sort of involvement of the consumer or the person on the street, right? You had telephones, you had Well, cars were, definitely people had to learn something of how their car worked if they were going to buy a car. But that wasn't quite as widespread as the radio became in those early years. The whole I called it in that presentation, tinker culture, sort of started there, and if you look at these magazines, there's all these ads for, take this correspondence course and become a technician or a repairman or something like that. There was the whole beginning of this culture of people being enthralled by technology, but also having some kind of agency around it and being able to learn how it works. Like you could open the back of your radio and figure out how the tubes worked, and you could take them to a repair shop if one of them blew out, or you could do it yourself, or you can start building your own radios. That was something that didn't quite exist before. And then, the Depression hit, that put a crimp in things for consumers. But what I find interesting is that at the end of all that, you have things like the World's Fairs, which, those still put out that message that, the future is going to be great. We're going to have all these things for you. Life is going to be so much better. Your home is going to be completely different, and you have some kind of agency. So there was a sort of melding of the popular imagination, scientific innovation, reality, fantasy, and all of these ideas being expressed and disseminated in magazines, publications, comic books, pulps, movies, serials. People would go to World's Fairs and have that really drilled into them that the future is going to be fantastic, right? And all of that just comes to a point where there's World War II, and then the war ends because there's something called the atom bomb, and suddenly here's the fruition of a whole ton of this innovation. But now there's this question like, wait, I thought life was supposed to be great. And now it's like, will there be life after 1945, And again, getting back to this idea of experiences that are hard to convey, I started doing research on how Americans processed the bomb after it happened.
Yeah, that's pretty symbolic as well.
It's amazing to think about the fact that nowadays, when we think about the end of World War II, you just imagine, the images that come to mind are the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square, right? The jubilation, right? But in doing research after that, when was it? Was it July of 45?
August of 45.
August. Yeah, when Hiroshima happened, and then Nagasaki, people were like in shock. For like a month after that, all the newspapers and magazines, even like women's McCall's or something, I forget which magazines, they were all filled with letters and articles and debates about, well, what now? People were terrified because they were like, we won the war, but what does that victory mean? Because this is a whole new world we're suddenly in. And what happened to Japan could very conceivably happen to us. And eventually, the way American culture works and the way, marketing works, and with initiatives from the government, eventually everyone sort of, they were able to sort of sublimate all of their terror. And it was always there underneath it all. But the narrative of, exceptional America and this amazing future and the American dream and suburban culture, that, that rode high, but underneath it was still that half buried terror of, well, this could all go away like in an instant. Right. And I think that the UFO, and of course, this doesn't start with me. I mean, the amazing thing is that Carl Jung was around at that time. We were kind of lucky in a way that he was around in that era to process that stuff. Have you guys read the Jung's book on flying saucers? It came out in the late 50s, I think. I started really reading that after I did that first presentation, and I somewhat a little bit disheartened because I was like, oh my God, all this stuff that I'm thinking about. He wrote about a lot of that stuff, like the psychological import of the flying saucer. He wrote about that stuff back as it was happening. And he was starting to get into things like, why is it circular? Because it's sort of a mandala. It's a symbol of wholeness and unity. And that was a chunk of where I was already heading with my thinking and my investigation. So that first presentation really was about American culture, post-war, and the sort of zeitgeist where the flying saucer and consumer tinker culture they're all part of the same sort of continuum, this imaginal, as I call it, because it encompassed everything from, hard reality, something that you could build in your garage, to something completely far out that you would see in Fate magazine. It was all part of the same sort of continuum. And I think that all sort of started to collapse as we headed into the 60s. I think one reason was the miniaturization and the birth of the transistor, and technology started becoming opaque. It started getting to the point where folks no longer had an intuitive grasp of what was going on inside of their devices. And now that's absolutely the case. All of our devices are these little black mirror brick things, and we have no idea it's wafer thin now anyway. We have no concept of what goes on in our devices and how they connect to the wider world. And another thing that happened while that was going on was that I call it infrastructure. The infrastructure of technology used to be visible, and then it sort of went away. Everything got the user interface. Mm-hmm. The whole idea of the user interface smoothed over, or was supposed to smooth over, anything that felt alien or too technological to handle. So this is why we no longer have things like what do you call it? The TV signal, the test pattern.
Yeah, the
test pattern is something that it was almost like a blip. It was basically sort of like the seams of the industry and the sort of early technology of television showing, right? Now you wouldn't see something like that. It would be almost like going to a printing house and taking a sheet of a book or a magazine that's in the middle of being printed, and you look at the edges of it and you see all of the registration marks. Well, all that gets trimmed away in the final product, right? The test pattern was sort of the same thing. It was still around for people to see and wonder about, because that was television in its infancy. But now media is slick and shiny, and the seams don't show, and they're not supposed to, because you're supposed to have a seamless experience so that you can make your purchases. And
it sounds like you're saying that that our technology is becoming as mysterious as those saucers were, and like the Zanesville saucer is kind of like this slick, dark, shiny object without any guts in it.
Yeah, no, that's basically what I've been seeing. And it goes along with the narrative that's been happening, the way it's changed. In the early days, when people met aliens, they were friendly space brothers, right? You had contactees that evolved or degenerated into abductees, and the friendly, godlike big brother aliens started morphing into this more sinister, more alien presence of the Greys.
Yeah, so there was a definite shift in the 70s.
Yep.
And into the 80s.
Yep. It's sort of, I can't make the claim that this is absolutely, related, but there seems to be an overall shift in zeitgeist that shows up in different ways. It shows up in the way that people experienced UFOs and alien encounters. And it sort of reflects what was going on with consumer technology. It's sort of consumer technology left that realm of whimsy and wonder, and it just sort of became a conveyance for media, right? All phones look the same. It's like, let's be real. Like you put an iPhone next to a Pixel next to some Android phone. And unless the skins are slightly different colors, they're essentially the same product.
Yeah, the design is the same, everything. Yeah.
Yep.
Looks like the monolith.
Yep, it looks like the monolith. And as people have been saying, I heard someone say this on Barbara Fisher's show. It's sort of like it's become mysterious. It's like there's the black mirror, and it's like a scrying surface. It's like there's a certain opacity to it. It's like that everything under the surface of that piece of glass is sort of a mystery.
Newbank took you on a journey of hip-hop exotica through the perilous valley of the Chiefs. Now hear the sounds of the surf-inspired ultimate tiki beach breaks. Available on all streaming platforms and digital stores. Limited edition cassette and merchandise available on Bandcamp at newbankhip-hop.bandcamp.com. Ultimate Tiki Beach Breaks.
But then you look back at the 50s and it's like every car looked different from every other car. It's like some had wings, some had, they came in all these crazy colors. And that was true of like all of consumer culture. It was all about color and choice and imagination and everything over time just sort of like reduced.
Yeah, if you look at some, people from another country, they will say that, and having been in the past married to someone that was from another country and their relatives saying everything in the United States looks the same now, but you're right. I mean, in the 50s, 60s, you didn't have that. You had a lot of variety.
Yep.
And now it's just, McDonald's and Burger King and KFC.
One big shopping center.
It's all, it's all the same. And,
right.
There's this uniformity, but it did not used to be that way.
Right. And the same thing happened with the UFOs. I mean, look at those charts that used to be put out by
and the occupants of the UFOs.
Yep. Yeah. Everything was like such variety,
Yep. I mean, and now when people think of the word alien, the first thing that comes to their mind are the grays,
They are featureless, essentially.
Yeah. But
yep, basically.
Before that, you had many different kinds of aliens.
Yeah.
There's a nice little chart that lays that out. It's got all of them on it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's look at the covers of pulps, it's like,
yeah,
imagination was rampant. The people were, artists were coming up with all sorts of different kinds of aliens. And that was kind of reflected in what people apparently experienced for real, right? But no, now everything's reduced to these very monolithic icons: the alien, the Tic Tac, the light. Just UFOs are just pinpoints of light now. I mean,
this is all broadly. Because it's all of our modern technological imaginal is this sleek,
right,
occulted, hidden, under the surface kind of thing.
Right. And if you ever see a video with some amazing looking UFO, your brain now instantly says CGI. Someone created that thing,
Yeah, I was going to bring that point up when you were talking about how special effects has spoiled us. Like now it really has, because whenever you see, now the opposite is now true, because whenever you see the purported fantastic UFO evidence, people are like, well, that can be done with a computer now. So you can't believe it.
Right. This is actually, that reminds me of something funny, which is that, remember when, what's his name? Blink 82 was on the Rogan show. Yeah. And that was kind of a
Tom DeLonge.
Yeah. And that was a threshold moment. That seemed like the beginning of the end of To the Stars, because it was so criticized, his appearance on there.
It was a shit show.
Yeah. And but there was one thing that I thought was interesting, which was he told them about, they were talking about the triangular UFOs, but the one that's supposedly the military reverse engineered,
the Aurora or something like that.
Yeah, it has it escapes me now, but it's a series of letters. But you know what I mean? It's the black triangle with the lights on the corners and the one big light in the middle. I mean, it's so rigid, this image, right? And DeLonge was saying, oh yeah, I mean, there's videos of this stuff. Here, just Google whatever the RT5. I don't know. I can't remember what the name of the thing was. And you hear Rogan typing, and he's watching it, and he's like, man, if I saw that shit in the movie, I would ask for my money back, because he thought it looked totally fake.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And I know the piece of video he's talking about. You just see this sort of triangle, and the light in the middle suddenly becomes a sphere of light, and then it flashes, and then it's gone, right? He thought that looked bad. To him, it was bad special effects, and so it was unconvincing. I actually looked at that video and I thought, that effect almost argues for maybe an authenticity, because they didn't go overboard with the CGI. It was kind of just weird. It was just like this ball of light, boink, the thing just disappears. And I'm thinking, maybe that's how the principle of something like that actually works. Maybe it doesn't look like something cool, like something out of a George Lucas film. Anyway,
it doesn't look too over the top.
It doesn't look too over the top, and it looks a little uncanny, right? So it's a little mysterious in the way that, kind of like the Zanesville saucer is a little mysterious. But yeah, it's our technology and our popular culture has kind of really muddied the waters in a way in terms of how we process this stuff.
Well, I wanted to hit a point real quick when you were talking about the atomic bomb and all about that. The flying saucer mythology really fed into that fear too. Like it seemed like it was a way to cope with that fear. Yeah. Because all the contactee stuff was always about, oh, well, we're watching you and we want to make sure that you don't blow yourself up. We want to make sure you don't blow us up. Right. That it was all but like you said, the benevolent space brothers. Right. And after a while, that all kind of just went away. And it seems like there's now, in some of these UFO encounters, there's a little bit more of the environmental stuff, the climate change stuff that goes into that now to some of those fears. So just those ideas of just like that, it kind of reflects a great fear in a certain way, and like they're going to save us and all these type of things. And I think now we look at some of the crisis that we're in now in the world, and there's definitely those people out there to be like, well, we hope that the aliens come down and save us, because you always heard about the
hope they come stop those missile sites from activating.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Well, they say, well, they came
Hover
and
over the silos.
cover over the silos and disarm them and all this kind of stuff. So
yeah,
there's definitely that the friendly space brother. There's some trace of it still left there somewhere.
I think there's still a through line, and I think the thing that connects them both is simply where we are in human history. And this is another idea that's kicked into my research, which is that the flying saucer came along at a time unlike any other in history, which is why, to me, it's the first truly abstract archetype. When you think of archetypes in mythology or in the paranormal, they always refer to something, right? The Fae are people. They're the gentry. They're, almost sort of a miniaturized nobility, right? It's always some kind of reference. Even when you look at, ancient reports of what are taken to be UFOs, that they're related to UFOs now. There's always some frame of reference. Ezekiel saw God on a throne, and he saw chariot wheels, except they were spinning within themselves, which is like that language that tells you there's something that he experienced that could not be processed. But the language still refers to things that were familiar to culture at that time. The UFO, except for really specific references like, some of the pulp covers that we've been talking about, kind of in a way came out of nowhere. And we know the provenance of the saucer idea. Supposedly it was just, a misreading of Kenneth Arnold's description, right? That they skipped what he saw in 1947, skipped like saucers on a pond. And so the press picked up on saucer and so it became a saucer.
And he was referring,
saucer.
Yeah, he was referring to the action.
Right.
He wasn't referring that they looked like that, but he was referring to the action that they made. And that is a distinction that a lot of people don't really remember.
What's fascinating is that people started seeing saucers anyway, and then photographing them. And, so then you get back to the whole thing. Is it a tulpa? What is it? But yeah, it was sort of like, but even like, what's a saucer? Why are people calling it a saucer? Because of the word that was used. No one thought that they were actual plates and cups and saucers. I mean, it was just simply a word used to describe something that there was no other word for. The fact that the UFO, the flying saucer, more particularly, to me, what makes it really different from the Fae, from ghosts, from Bigfoot, from what have you, it doesn't really refer to anything else. It's a form that seemed to come out of nowhere, but seemed so primed for people to embrace and to accept, and that it charged everyone's imagination. And that also drove part of my investigation. Like, why the saucers? Jung says it's because it's round and it's a mandala, which I accept as a partial explanation, but I kind of went beyond that in the sense that I really started trying to take this form apart. Like, what did humans, Americans in particular, what did they encounter in history that sort of seeded the impact of this form, this disc-like shape that everyone keeps seeing in the sky? And that led to all sorts of new rabbit holes that I'm hoping I can do some kind of justice to in that presentation. It just goes in so many different directions. But the other thing I was going to say about, to your point, Adam, there is still a through line because it's still a fear. It's still about a fear. And I think it's because my theory is that the flying saucer is the the daemon or the mythic archetype of the Anthropocene, right? Mm-hmm. We've reached a point in history where the impact of humans on the planet is so great that we've become the most influential force on the planet, on the weather, on the shape of the planet. And certainly in terms of, seeding our own extinction starting with the bomb. It may be a little too neat and pat, but I think there's this really beautiful symmetry to human history. If you think of the bomb being that 0 point, right? Like the birth of Christ was that sort of midpoint between that divides BC and AD. 1945, August 1945, to me is sort of like that point when you couldn't argue that we now live in the Anthropocene. Like we live in this whole new age where man's influence is so out of bounds compared to man's influence before. And it was a gradual process, but at that point, it just went like that. And one of my favorite sentences, I don't have the exact phrase in front of me, but one idea in Patrick Harpur's Daimonic Reality that made me sort of sit up and take notice was, because he was comparing the Fae with the aliens. And there's so much literature saying they're the same thing, right? There's a lot of authors are coming at this idea that the aliens are simply the Fae in modern garb. But he pointed something out that I never thought of before. The Fae, according to the Fae traditions, and even reflected in something like Lord of the Rings, the Fae are always leaving. There's this perpetual twilight idea associated with the Fae, that the world belonged to them, mankind came, and they were sort of exiting stage left. They were leaving for the other lands, right? Sailing off, like at the end of Lord of the Rings. And when folk researchers spoke to people in the British Isles who believed that there were Fae, it was always like, oh yeah, they're still around, but there used to be a lot more. My grandparents were talking about seeing them all the time, and you see them less, but you still see them. But that's like a perpetual theme. It's always been the Fae are leaving.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I think W.T. Watson, I don't know if we talked about this, but he definitely mentions that in his book, The Mysteries and the Myths book, the one we had on the previous episode. He mentions that. So yeah, it's interesting that you say that. That's something that I've when I really sat down to think about it, I was like, yeah, that's right.
But check out the sort of symmetry of it. So the Fae are always leaving, the aliens are always coming.
Right.
The aliens are always some portent of some future. And I just thought that was fascinating because he hit that right on. I'd never really made that. I'd never thought of that before, but Patrick Harpur said that, and that I'm like, yep, that is like atom bomb. Again, this may be pat and a little oversimplified, but if you think sort of atom bomb, middle of the 20th century, our technology from the Enlightenment to the atom bomb point, that was like a curve that went like this, and everything before that was more in the realm of the iconography of myth and religion and things that referred to nature or simple technology. And after the bomb, technology just became the gulf between human understanding and technology just became tangentially wider and wider and wider. So now that there's this sort of alienation happening between us and technology, and us and ourselves, and that seems to be the heart of this huge malaise that's set in with humanity post-war, post-World War II, post-bomb. I see it. I see this thing where it's like that's where we are now in the Anthropocene.
Yeah, it's a new beginning. It reminds me of a lot of elements of creation myths about, people call the dawning of the nuclear age, the opening of Pandora's box all the time.
Yeah.
This idea that we have the destructive power of gods now.
Mm-hmm. And that infrastructure I was talking about, in our media, it's gone away. You don't really see it. But in our landscape, it continues, right? So it's sort of like, when you think of the American landscape in the 19th century, almost up to World War II, it was essentially unchanged farmland, folks farming their land, crops. But then starting with the telephone and then with the car, with roads. But then it really took off after World War II, the way our landscape has, in a sense, become more alien. Our landscape has almost become something that reflects what you used to see on pulp science fiction covers than anything else. Right?
And the most untouched and mystic, what people think of as like a mystical landscape in the United States too, the desert Southwest were the places where they tested all those bombs.
Right. Something really cool, kind of freaky, but cool. If you look at New Mexico, right? Like Trinity Site and that whole surrounding part of the state, you can see on Google Maps, they're almost like mandalas. You see there's these huge circles that are in the landscape itself. And I'm not sure what they are. I mean, one of them is definitely the perimeter of the Trinity Site. And I know that there's a fence actually there, and it's only open part of the year. But I started poking around other areas in New Mexico, and it's like, there are these, you can't call them structures. They're more like just sort of an imprint. It's almost more like something in the texture of the land is, clearly not natural. They're big circles. And to me, it's just, nothing mysterious. I think it has to do with, bomb testing and stuff like that. But the way it sort of left its mark on the land is really interesting to me. As I come to the point where I'm going to pull this presentation together, that iconography of the simple circle is so prevalent in so much of this stuff. One thing that I noticed was a kind of toggling that happens in history between forms, right? Let me see if I can explain this. So the first aerial conveyances for human beings were balloons, right? And this is a product of, again, the Enlightenment, but it goes into the Romantic period where the first aeronauts, and again, this is talking about experiences that were incomprehensible to people at first. The first balloonists really captured the imagination of Europeans, people in France, people in Great Britain. And very quickly, a lot of people started getting into the whole thing of ballooning and creating their own balloons and going up. And eventually that mania kind of died down because the balloon was not very practical. The balloon was still at the mercy of weather and air currents. And actually, a lot of a lot of tragedies happened because of that, because the humans that built balloons had very little control over them. They were at the mercy of all sorts of things. So while there was this big explosion of wonder and inspiration that the balloons, or the aerostats, as they were called at the time, offered, it kind of went away, it kind of went under. But then they started coming back. And of course, the great icon for that was the airship, the wave of 1897, right? So what's different there? It's still a balloon. Most of the descriptions of these things were gas-filled balloons of some kind, but they were ships. They were almost never round, right? They were usually what became the Zeppelin shape, So here you've got this, and again, this is my visual mind just working things out iconographically. You start out with something round, but this round thing has no volition. It floats in the atmosphere. The next phase of that is the airship, which can be steered like a ship on the sea. And that means that now you have something that's got a trajectory. It's linear, right? So you go from round to sort of rod shaped. And then very quickly, it becomes reality. Zeppelins start being built, real airships start being built to the point where they were a factor in World War One.
Right. And then, as you said, there's also the factor of control. So now we can control their movements, whereas with a balloon, you really couldn't, you kind of drifted with the wind.
Right. So here's this sort of, evolution from round to pointed and linear and rod-like, which has a trajectory, which can be controlled. And it's in line with things like rockets and missiles and things that you fire off from one location and you aim it and it lands in a different location, right? So you have this whole sensibility of shifting from something that's kind of random and organic and natural, and then now you've got something that's very directed, that pierces space, that pierces if it's a weapon, pierces its target and destroys its target. And it's I'm like looking at this sort of segue of things. I'm realizing, oh gosh, I'm starting to get into the whole sexual symbolism thing of
swords and pentacles.
Yep, swords and pentacles. And at a certain point, I just laughed. And I thought, well, let me just keep going with this because actually there's something here beyond the purely sexual, but there's still that principle of the rod or the projectile or the sword versus something round and encompassing. And I think it's really interesting that in the middle of the 20th century, when our realistic fears are based on ordnance coming in from enemy territory, right, or planes or missiles, and the ultimate expression of that is the bomb. But the bomb is something new, right? The first visual that people get of the bomb is not the plane, is not a missile, is not a piece of ordnance. I mean, yeah, there were pictures of the two bombs, Fat Man, right, for Nagasaki, and I forget the name of the one that dropped on Hiroshima.
Little boy.
Yeah. But the icon of the nuclear age was the mushroom cloud. Again, something that was almost beyond human ken. So here's this thing that sort of like grows. It almost seems like a life form. I'm sure that the early photographs and newsreels of bomb tests were hellifying. It's like, they themselves must have been something that were really hard for the viewer to grasp at first, like what was going on. It took the realm of war outside of firing weapons at each other and this whole idea of trajectory and something that's destroyed to this is something that almost seems to balloon out of nothing. It comes up out of the earth, right? It's like, it looks like a mushroom. It looks like a tree. It almost looks like something alive. I think that took war and destruction and immediately, even just visually, put it on a whole other, almost mythical level because the human mind couldn't wrap itself around what they were looking at. They hadn't seen anything like that before. Mushroom clouds have been documented in art, people have reported them. I mean, an explosion just has to be big enough to create that kind of a dynamic system, right? Something that sort of like comes in, the heat rises and it's sort of like, I forget the name of the structure, but it's sort of like a donut-like structure that sort of explodes at the top and pulls into itself underneath. it's been seen, and there are paintings of big explosions from the 1800s that look exactly like a mushroom cloud. There's this crazy stained glass window in one of the Gothic churches in Great Britain. Oh gosh, I forget which one it is, but it's a depiction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'm going to have the image in the show. It's crazy because it's a column of fragments of buildings, like what look like towers and castles, like rising in a column, and the top of the stained glass window is this big kind of cloud. And so the principle of that kind of level of destruction was sort of understood, but it didn't become part of the popular imagination until 1945, when people opened up Life magazine or whatever and saw these images of this crazy thing. And I think that the UFO, the flying saucer, one of the reasons that it looked the way it did was it sort of reflects, in a way, this fear of people, this new fear of people that takes this very particular form. If you think about it, if you take away the column and you just look at the top part of the mushroom cloud, there's something almost saucer-like about it. The structure of it is very much like, it follows the principle of the growth of a tree, and it follows the principle of how a mushroom grows. But here is this thing, the flying saucer, that seems to have its own volition and is sort of disconnected from the earth. It's like it's in the sky. It's sort of like, and this is where the whole idea of the spark in the vessel kind of comes from. The spark historically is a force of nature that mankind, or a Western man, went through a lot of effort to contain from, let's say, the time of the Enlightenment to the time of the bomb. It was a time when scientists began understanding that the greatest forces in the universe were kind of invisible, and they were trying to find ways of capturing it intellectually in terms of understanding, and at a certain point physically capturing, right? During the Enlightenment, certain scientists in France, in Great Britain, or Scotland, I think, started isolating things that became ultimately understood as elements. One of the intellectual figures of the Enlightenment in France, who died during the Revolution, was Lavoisier. I think that's how you pronounce it. And he basically discovered oxygen. There are paintings of Lavoisier with these big glass globes, which look like glass globes. They look empty, but they actually contain oxygen. So this idea of the human mind sort of isolating something that was invisible, and beginning to understand it and naming it, right? So mankind started isolating certain aspects of this sort of powerful invisible universe, the gases, oxygen. I forget who it was in Scotland, that Cavendish, I think, who discovered hydrogen, which was super important eventually to the whole dirigible airship field, right? Because you needed something that was lighter than air. This was all happening in the Enlightenment. People were like, the science of the invisible. Scientists were beginning to understand things that were beyond the scope of normal human being to process and to understand, or to even see in a lot of cases. So this idea of the spark in a vessel, which also comes out of, it's an old idea. It comes out of alchemy. It comes out of certain parts of Kabbalah. The idea of a soul and the idea of the body, right? That's the spark, that's the vessel. But it became more and more important and more part of the process of science and industry and technology and understanding how the universe worked, from the Enlightenment through the 1800s to the point where you've got Edison creating the light bulb, which became the first really iconic invention that captured that idea of the spark in a vessel. I like to think of it as sort of like a technological version of a genie in a bottle. Here's this incredible power, and yet we've gotten to the point where we could sort of capture it and start to do things with it. And once Edison captured the spark of electricity in a light bulb, which interestingly enough became one of the first sort of symbolic abstract icons in popular culture. Like from that point on, the idea of an idea became a light bulb, like the Eureka thing. It's like light bulb, because everyone understood what that meant without saying it. It meant an idea so new that it lights everything up. And hey, the first guy to do that was Edison. But then that led quickly into scientists figuring out the structure of the atom, right? Because they didn't quite understand electricity even after they had captured it in a light bulb. But very rapidly, scientists began to break that down and understand that, we're talking about a flow of electrons, and we're talking about atoms, which had been theorized since ancient times, but no one really knew what an atom was. And what's really crazy is that within the period of like 30 years, scientists went from thinking of the atom as some kind of minuscule portion of matter that involved an envelope of electrons to, I think, at Rutherford, saying, well, it's not just electrons, there's a nucleus, to understanding what's in that nucleus. It's kind of crazy to think that in 1900, I don't think they had the idea of the electron orbit yet. But over the next few decades, they went from some kind of, the atom had electrons in it, to the atom had an envelope of electrons, to they're in orbits around the nucleus. And at the same time, that jibed with what astronomers were learning about the structure of the universe, that we have, the structure of the solar system, the discovery of galaxies, and that galaxies were circular and they had everything revolved around a core. So that there was a sense of what was invisible, or at least not visible to the naked eye, and not something that you can't really describe using metaphor anymore. Metaphor became kind of useless at this point. So that something abstract like the idea of an atom with electrons revolving around a nucleus, which also reflected the solar system idea. All of these ideas came into popular consciousness all around the same time. And on the one hand, it meant that behind the scenes, scientists were making leaps and bounds, so that you went from barely understanding what an atom was to, within 30, 40 years, creating a nuclear weapon. And at the same time, in the popular imagination, you had the explanation of matter being made of these little bits with orbits. Oh, and by the way, space looks like that too. The popular imagination took all of that in. It was all reinforced by science fiction, by these, by radio magazines. And I think a lot of that ended up seeding this image that became the flying saucer.
In the time that we have left, the presentation that you're going to give, this is going to be an updated version of what you did before, but this is also going to have a lot more to it. Like, you've added a lot to this.
Yeah, I've gone down a bunch of avenues. I've gone back to, before it was all about American culture. Now I'm like, now I'm starting out in the Enlightenment.
Western culture as a whole, yeah.
Western culture as a whole, yep.
Right.
And also taking up the question of like, well, what does the future have in store? This flying saucer shape. I think this flying saucer form, that icon is starting to evolve into what we're understanding as the structure of the galaxy and the black hole at its center. if you look at artists' depictions of those things, it just echoes, some of these all its visual iconography that came before. So the presentation will be a visual reflection of what I have been very clumsily trying to string together in words.
I want to point out that you are an artist and a designer, and so that is going to help you tremendously. And it did on the previous presentation. It was really beautiful. The presentations and slides and how you designed everything, that is going to help to tell this story and narrative symbolically. So, it really is a great interactive thing to see. Yeah.
It's in a way a continuation of what I do for a living. I'm a graphic designer, but specifically I've worked in branding, identity. And part of that process is simply to, if you get a client who needs they've got a new product or a new company, and they need some kind of image that works as a logo, something that's very simple, right? And an easy read and iconic, something that people remember. Even though a brand identity is supposed to be really simple and streamlined like that, the idea is that it's an icon that represents a whole range of associations that become the brand, right? And so the process of brainstorming a brand, like the first thing you do when you get an assignment like that is you do research. You find out what is it that the client wants people to understand or envision about their product. So then, you get into all sorts of stuff like what are the values of this product? What will it touch on emotionally? What kind of story does it echo that's probably already in the consumer's mind because that story has been there through mythology, through popular culture, or anything like that. So research is sort of like engineering an icon by starting with the past and sort of taking all of that and engineering an icon. I call this presentation reverse engineering an archetype. One, it's a play on the idea of reverse engineering alien technology. But what I'm trying to do with this presentation is take this icon that no one person created and sort of running the process backwards, taking something that's a perfect image of something powerful. So what's in its DNA? Why is it powerful? What is so powerful about this simple form? And that's the process I went through. And that's why I ended up back at the Enlightenment. It's like, there's a lot of threads to follow.
Well, I think we're really looking forward to this presentation. I think this is going to be great. We're going to be doing this at the end of the week that this comes out. So April 22nd at 8 p.m. Eastern time is when we're going to start. And just say Eastern time, just that's basic for anybody wherever you live, figure that out accordingly. But as we said before, that's available on Eventbrite. I'll have the link up posted to this episode. But also another good way to do it is to join our Patreon, which you can become a $10 a month member and you just get access. So you don't have to pay again and again and again through Eventbrite. So consider that. But Marco, this has been awesome. You're going to stick around with us just for like a little short Patreon segment, but
absolutely.
Where can people find you? Where can people find your work and what you do and all this type of thing?
Well, this is where I feel super lucky because I get to do a show like this alongside, in the company of people who have written books or do their own podcasts or have blogs. At the moment of speaking these words, what I have is a website address and a plan for a blog. And at some point, I would love for it to evolve into a podcast, but baby steps. I'm a working dad, and it's hard to find. I don't have grants, so it's hard to find these little moments of time. But I do. My website will be luminosity.space. So think of the word luminosity, but portmanteaued with liminal. So luminosity.space is the URL. I've started poking around on Twitter under that name. But hopefully really soon. And I can hear all the people that I've told this to in the last year or two laughing. David Metcalf and Barbara Fisher and Stephanie Quick. Yeah. I'm going to have this blog. I'm going to have this site. It is happening. It's just happening very slowly, but that's the URL. So watch that space.
Top secret project from Marco Acevedo.
Right. I wish I could put in an image of like something that looks like something out of a Black Money lab or something.
Remind everyone what the title of the presentation is.
The title is "The Spark and the Vessel: Reverse Engineering the Flying Saucer Archetype."
Perfect.
That was the whole thing. Yeah.
Perfect.
I know it's a little bit of a long one, but.
And Sergio, you can tell everybody where they could find us on our Patreon.
If you want to join this mystic crew, you can head over to patreon.com/Conspirinormal. And for $10 and up, like we have beaten to death, you can you have an open invitation to these presentations every month, but you also get the added benefits of the extra Patreon episode, like the one we're about to record with Marco, and other transmissions from the Center of Conspirinormalist Propaganda. For the $20 and up level, you get to join the Ancient Circle of Strange Realities and get some cool t-shirts. That is the extra special upper echelon of all of these various secret societies that we are heading. That is at patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
All right, guys, that's excellent. Join us over on the Patreon side. We're going to continue with Marco Acevedo, and we will be back next week. I think we're going to do a Paranoid Style, so stay tuned for that on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.